Let's speak to Javier Farje, a journalist and Latin American analyst who joins us from central London. Javier, good to speak to you today. Thanks for taking the time to do so.
Thank you for having me. Thank you very much.
Just looking at some of the comments in Stuart Ramsey's report there, and indeed the Pope in the last few minutes, who's calling for a just and peaceful solution. The feeling on the streets where Stuart was certainly to try to bring change through peaceful means and trying to sign people up on the streets there to defect from the military. In your view, is that a likely path to some sort of resolution?
No, it's very difficult. First of all, the offer of amnesty, which your correspondent talked about, would be rejected by the armed forces because that would be an assumption that they did something wrong and they don't think they have done something wrong. Within the last 48 hours, and I spoke to my sources in Caracas just before we were on air, the military are firmly behind Mr. Maduro. That is a problem for Mr. Guaido. The problem that Mr. Guaido has is that although he has all the support from many countries in the international community, the US, Canada, the European Union probably, he does not have the control over the country. He might control some of the states where the opposition has governors, but he doesn't have control of the country. And the armed forces so far seem to be firmly on the side of the government for many reasons. So in that respect, without that support, he won't be able to do anything about that. And Mr. Maduro would feel very confident that that is the case. Not long ago, at the same time as Mr. Guaido was delivering a speech, there was another speech delivered by Mr. Maduro from the presidential palace of Miraflores, and he was surrounded by the commanders of the armed forces, where he talked about, once again, imperialism trying to destroy the democracy in Venezuela and the Americans trying to dictate, the policies in Venezuela. So the fact that he's always surrounded by the military confirms, for the time being anyway, we don't know whether those things are going to change, that the military are still very much on the side of the government, and that is a problem for Mr. Guaido. The advantage Mr. Guaido has is that he's managed to unify an opposition which was very fragmented before, very divided, with a lot of internal fights. He has that strength. But without the military, it's going to be very difficult for Mr. Guaido to do anything.
Given the importance you're obviously attaching to the military, and particularly that top establishment of the military in Venezuela, who are still behind Mr. Maduro, how much influence do other external nations and powers have in this, given that domestically it doesn't look like they are sort of abandoning him at this time? When you look at people like China and Russia, who have advised against the stance that the United States and the European countries are taking, would it be a possible changing point if they were to decide that actually the investments they've made in Venezuela in terms of arms and loans are not going to be something that is working for them long term?
That's a very good question. Venezuela owes around $50 billion to China. If the new government of Mr. Guaido promised to honor that debt, China might rethink its support for Venezuela. In the case of Russia, we are talking about here a geopolitical situation by which Russia is opposing any attempts by the US to influence Venezuela. The speech by the Russian ambassador at the Security Council was very strong against the US's sort of intervention in Venezuela. The other country which is crucial in Latin America is Mexico. Mexico has decided to take a distance and not to recognize Mr. Guaido. There's another element which is extremely important that has not been reported widely, is that the Organization of American States has failed to give a majority of support for Mr. Guaido. They only managed to get 16 votes out of the 18 votes that the OAS needs to pass a resolution. So there's no majority in the Organization of American States yet anyway to support Mr. Guaido. That would be probably a blessing in disguise, because that might be a way to maybe try to promote a kind of a dialogue between both sides, because this situation could escalate to violence, and that's exactly what everybody wants to avoid. So you're absolutely right. It depends how these international sort of links work. But Mr. Maduro will not call for a new election, that's for sure. He will not accept any kind of pressure from the European Union, which has decided that they want new elections, and he will rely on the support of the military and, of course, Russia, China and Turkey, which is very important.
Given this status that you're describing then, if it doesn't escalate to violence, which of course we hope it doesn't, and it also doesn't, the domestic pressure on the streets does not change anything, what do you think is the course of action? Because I suppose, everyone knows the United States has to be very careful in this situation, given their history in the region, their history of military involvement and coups in the region.
Absolutely.
So if that's not an option and peaceful transition isn't an option, what happens here?
You're absolutely right. When Mr. Trump suggested military intervention in Venezuela last year, it was rejected by everybody in Latin America, including countries that support the opposition. That's not an option that would be acceptable for anybody. Before Mr. Guaido declared himself president, he had a meeting with top-ranking officials of the Maduro government. He, at the beginning, denied that, but he's now accepted that there were some meetings when they were trying to find some kind of compromise. Now, since both presidents, let's call them president for the sake of argument, have their own strengths and their own weaknesses, that might be a vehicle for them to discuss something, some kind of solution, maybe elections in a reasonable period, observed by international observers, to be able to solve the situation. But at the moment, it doesn't seem that either side wants to escalate a violent situation, and that could only be good news. That could only lead to the possibility of some kind of a dialogue between the opposition and the government. That would be the only way. Otherwise, splitting the army would be very violent, and a bloodbath could be, a situation that nobody wants in Venezuela, neither the opposition nor the government. They both have the weaknesses and they both have the strengths, and they might play that to find some kind of a middle way solution to solve this terrible crisis. In the meantime, people are still starving and people are still having problems to feed their families.
Yeah. Javier Farje, thank you for speaking to us. Really appreciate your insight today.